The stock tank sat a quarter-mile from my trailer, fed by a windmill that creaked and groaned like an old man getting out of bed. Every evening, right around sunset, the whitetails would come down from the cedar breaks to drink. I'd sit on my porch with a Lone Star sweating in my hand and watch them. Does mostly, sometimes a young buck still figuring out what his antlers were for. It was the best part of my day. Those 20 minutes of quiet while the sky turned orange and purple over the hill country. I'd been working the Holloway ranch for going on 3 years by then, 34 years old, divorced, living in a single wide on the back 40 of 3,000 acres of cedar and live oak. The trailer wasn't much. 2 bedrooms I didn't need, a kitchen the size of a closet, and plumbing that knocked like someone was trying to get in whenever I ran hot water. But it was mine, or at least it felt that way. Old Man Holloway let me stay rent-free as part of my salary, which wasn't much to begin with. But out here, money stretched further than it did in the city. I was the ranch's mechanic, though that title covered a lot of ground. Diesel engines mostly, the old John Deere tractor that Holloway refused to replace, the fleet of F-200s that hauled feed and fencing, the backup generator that kicked on whenever the power lines sagged under ice. But I also fixed whatever else broke down. The hydraulics on the squeeze chute, the well pump, the ancient hay baler that should have been scrapped a decade ago. My hands were always black with grease, my knuckles perpetually skinned. I didn't mind. The work kept my head quiet. That mattered more than I liked to admit. After the divorce, my head had been anything but quiet. Marlene and I had been married for 6 years, and I'd spent at least 4 of those years being a lousy husband. Not mean, not unfaithful, just absent. Working doubles at the shop in Austin. Coming home too tired to talk. Letting the distance grow until we were strangers sharing a bed. When she finally left, she didn't even seem angry. Just tired. "I don't know who you are anymore," she'd said, and the worst part was I didn't either. Our daughter Sophie was 12 now. She lived with Marlene in a nice house in Austin's suburbs, went to a good school, had friends whose names I couldn't keep straight. I called her every Sunday night at 7 and we'd talk for 20 minutes about her week. Soccer practice, math tests, whatever show she was watching on Netflix. She was patient with me in a way that made my chest hurt. I could hear her trying, and I could hear the silences where she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Some Sundays I'd sit on the porch after hanging up and finish a whole 6-pack, just staring at the dark. The isolation suited me. That's what I told myself. The truth was probably more complicated, but I wasn't in the habit of examining it too closely. My days started at 5:30, before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. I'd make coffee in the percolator, the old-fashioned kind that sat on the burner because the Keurig Marlene had given me years ago stopped working, and I never bothered to replace it and eat whatever I'd cooked the night before. Usually eggs. Sometimes just toast with peanut butter if I hadn't made it to the grocery store in town. By 6, I was at the equipment barn, a corrugated metal building about a mile up the road that housed the tractors and most of my tools. The Holloways had ranched this land for 4 generations. The current patriarch, Earl Holloway, was 73 and moved like every joint in his body was held together with baling wire and spite. His wife, Marlene, spent most of her time visiting family, and his son had taken a job in Houston, doing something with computers that Earl didn't understand and didn't care to. That left the old man running the operation with a rotating crew of hired hands and his grandson Tyler, who was 22 and about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. Tyler wasn't bad exactly, just young and soft in ways that ranch work would eventually hammer out of him, or wouldn't, in which case he'd end up in Houston with his father. He spent too much time on his phone, complained about the heat, and had a habit of disappearing when the hard jobs came around. But he showed up most days, and he could drive the tractor in a reasonably straight line, so Earl kept him on. Fenris. Tyler's voice cut through the morning air as I was elbow deep in the F250's engine bay, trying to trace an oil leak that had been slowly driving me crazy for a week. "Granddad wants you up at the house." I pulled my head out and squinted at him. He was wearing a pearl snap shirt that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill and boots that had never seen actual mud. "What for?" "Didn't say, just said, come up when you get a minute." I wiped my hands on a rag that was already more grease than cloth. "Tell him I'll be there in 20. Tyler nodded and wandered off toward his truck, already thumbing at his phone. I watched him go, feeling the familiar mix of irritation and something like envy. He'd never had to work for anything in his life. Never known what it felt like to watch your marriage fall apart because you were too proud to ask for help. Never sat in a trailer by yourself, wondering if this was all there was going to be. But then he was 22. I'd been pretty stupid at 22 too. Earl was on his porch when I pulled up, sitting in the wooden rocker that had belonged to his father. The main house was a sprawling limestone ranch house, built in the 1920s and added onto every generation since. It sat on a small rise that gave a view of the surrounding pastures, and on clear days you could see all the way to the purple smudge of the next county's hills. "Tractor's acting up again," Earl said without preamble, making a sound like a cat in a washing machine. "Which tractor?" "The John Deere, the good one." I suppressed a sigh. There was no good John Deere on this ranch. There was only the one that ran most of the time and the one that didn't. "I'll take a look this afternoon." "Probably the hydraulic pump again." Earl nodded slowly, his eyes on the pasture. The man never seemed to blink. "You notice anything strange lately?" The question caught me off guard. "Strange how?" "The dogs." He gestured toward the house where 3 blue heelers were sprawled on the porch in the shade. Good dogs, all of them, smart, loyal, and absolutely fearless when it came to coyotes or rattlesnakes or ornery bulls. "They won't go past the yard after dark. Used to be I couldn't keep them out of the brush. Now they won't even piss off the porch once the sun goes down." I looked at the dogs. Buddy, the oldest, lifted his head and met my eyes. There was something in his expression I didn't like. Something that looked almost like worry. "Coyotes, maybe?" I offered. "Could be a pack moved in, got them spooked." Earl made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You heard any coyotes lately?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. I thought about the last few weeks, the evenings on my porch, the silence that had settled over the land. I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard coyotes. Not a single yip or howl. "Now that you mention it," I said slowly. "Week and a half," Earl said. "Maybe 2. Used to hear them every night. Now nothing." He rocked back in his chair, still staring at the pasture. "Probably nothing. Just noticed is all." But there was something in his voice, a tightness that didn't match his casual words. I'd known Earl Holloway for 3 years, and I'd never seen him spooked by anything. Not the drought 2 summers back that nearly broke him. Not the rattler that got him in the leg and laid him up for a month. Not even the cancer scare last spring that turned out to be nothing. "I'll keep an eye out," I said. He nodded once, still not looking at me. You do that. That night I sat on my porch with my Lone Star and watched the stock tank. The windmill turned lazily in the evening breeze, its blades catching the dying light. The sky went from blue to gold to deep purple, and the first stars started to prick through. But no deer came. I waited until full dark, until the mosquitoes drove me inside and the beer was warm in my hand. Not a single whitetail, not even a rabbit. The stock tank sat there glinting in the starlight, its surface undisturbed except for the steady drip from the windmill's pipe. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Deer change their patterns sometimes. Maybe there was better water somewhere else, a spring I didn't know about, a seep in one of the draws. Maybe the dogs and the coyotes and the deer were all separate things, coincidences that didn't add up to anything. But I lay in bed that night and listened to the silence, the deep, heavy silence, where there should have been insects and night birds and, yes, the distant yipping of coyotes. The silence pressed against my windows like something trying to get in. I didn't sleep well. The next morning I walked down to the stock tank before my coffee was even cool enough to drink. The sun was just clearing the ridge, turning the world gold and pink, and for a moment everything looked normal. The water sparkling, the grass bent with dew, a mockingbird singing from the nearest cedar. Then I saw the tracks. They were in the mud at the tank's edge, where the ground stayed soft year-round from the windmill's overflow. Deer tracks covered the area, overlapping and smudged. But these were different. These were canine. Dog tracks, I thought at first, but even as the word formed in my mind, I knew it wasn't right. They were too big. I crouched down and studied them, my coffee forgotten in my hand. The prints were easily 6 inches long, with deep claw marks at the front of each toe. The stride between them was wrong too, 3 feet at least, maybe closer to 4. No dog I knew could make tracks like these. Not even a Great Dane, not even an Irish wolfhound. Whatever had left these prints was massive, and it walked on 2 legs. I stared at that realization for a long moment, trying to make it not true. But the evidence was right there in front of me. 2 parallel lines of prints, left and right, with a stride that made sense for something walking upright. Bipedal. The word tasted wrong in my mouth, like something out of a bad movie. I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures, then stood there looking at the tree line. The cedars were thick and dark, even in full morning light. Anything could be in there. Anything could be watching. Just a big dog, I said out loud, and the sound of my own voice made me feel like an idiot. Maybe a feral something, Great Dane mix, like you'd see on one of those internet videos. The mockingbird had stopped singing. I hadn't noticed until just then, but the morning had gone quiet around me. No insects, no birds, just the creak of the windmill and the soft lap of water against the tank's edge. I walked back to my trailer faster than I needed to. Over the next few days, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. The tracks were unusual, sure, but there was probably a rational explanation. Maybe someone's exotic pet had gotten loose. Maybe there was a wolf hybrid that had escaped from some idiot's backyard. That happened sometimes. People who thought they wanted a wild animal until they realized what that actually meant. I mentioned it to Tyler when I saw him at the equipment barn, and he just shrugged. My buddy in Fredericksburg says there's been big cats spotted out past his place. Mountain lions coming down from the plateau. Maybe that's what's got everything spooked. Mountain lions don't make tracks like that. How would you know? You ever seen a mountain lion track? I hadn't, not in person, but I'd grown up around dogs. I knew canine prints when I saw them. Still, the mountain lion theory was comforting, so I let myself believe it for a while. Cats were rare but not unheard of in the hill country. A big Tom could explain the missing deer, the silent coyotes, maybe even the dog's strange behavior. It made sense in a way that my other thoughts didn't. I set up a trail camera near the stock tank. It was an old Bushnell I'd bought years ago for deer season, motion activated with an infrared flash that wouldn't spook whatever it photographed. I mounted it on a cedar post about 50 yards from the water and angled it to cover the muddy bank where I'd found the tracks. There, I said to no one. Now we'll see what we're dealing with. The next morning I checked the camera's SD card on my laptop. There were 12 images captured overnight. Deer approaching the water, finally, which made me feel a little better. But images 9 through 12 were different. They were almost entirely black. The infrared flash illuminating nothing but darkness and a few blurred tree branches. Malfunction, I thought. Motion triggered by wind in the leaves. But in the corner of image 11, there were 2 small points of light. Eyes. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the tiny reflective dots. They were positioned wrong for a deer. Too high, maybe 5 or 6 feet off the ground, and too close together. A deer's eyes would be on the sides of its head, widely spaced. These were forward-facing like a predator's, like mine. Just a glitch, I muttered. Light reflecting off something, water droplet on the lens. I deleted the images and reformatted the card. When I put it back in the camera that afternoon, my hands were shaking slightly. I told myself it was the coffee. That night I mentioned the quiet coyotes to Earl again, trying to sound casual about it. We were standing outside the equipment barn while I explained what was wrong with the tractor's hydraulic pump, and the old man was nodding along like he was listening, but his eyes kept drifting to the tree line. My grandfather used to talk about these hills, Earl said, interrupting my explanation of pressure seals. Said there were things here before the ranches, before the settlers, things that belonged to the land. I waited for him to continue, but he just stood there staring at the cedars. The sun was getting low, and the shadows were stretching long across the pasture. What kind of things? I finally asked. Earl shook his head slowly. He never said exactly. Just said you didn't look for them and you didn't talk about them. You just hoped they weren't hungry. He seemed to shake himself and his eyes refocused on me. Anyway, get that pump fixed when you can. We need the tractor running by end of week. He walked back toward the house, his boots crunching on the gravel, and I stood there watching the shadows grow until the cold started to seep through my jacket. 3 nights later, I heard it. I was on my porch. Same as always, though, I'd stopped expecting the deer to show. The beer in my hand was my third of the evening, enough to take the edge off, but not enough to dull my senses. The stars were out, thick and bright the way they only get when you're miles from city lights, and the windmill was creaking its endless rhythm. Then something screamed in the cedar breaks. I'd heard coyotes before. Their yips and howls were part of the hill country soundtrack. I'd heard foxes too, which could make sounds that would wake you from a dead sleep, thinking someone was being murdered. I'd even heard a bobcat once, a sound like a woman shrieking that had made my blood run cold. This wasn't any of those things. It was deep, for one, deeper than any animal that size had a right to be. It started low, almost subsonic, a vibration I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. Then it rose, became a howl, but wrong somehow, like a recording played at the wrong speed. There were harmonics in it that didn't make sense, overtones that seemed to come from different directions, and underneath it all, so faint I might have imagined it, something that sounded almost like words. The howl cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. No insects, no night birds. Even the windmill seemed to have stopped, though I knew that wasn't possible. The world had gone absolutely still, and I was sitting on my porch in the dark with a beer going warm in my hand and my heart trying to punch its way out of my chest. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the feeling to pass, for the night sounds to slowly return, for my breathing to approach something normal. Long enough to convince myself that I'd heard a bobcat, or maybe a fox, or maybe just the wind doing something strange in the cedar breaks. But I went inside and locked the door behind me, something I hadn't done since moving to the ranch, and I checked the lock twice before I finally went to bed. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I dozed in fits and starts, jerking awake at every creak of the trailer's metal skin, every gust of wind against the windows. Sometime around 3 a.m, I gave up entirely and sat at my kitchen table with the lights on, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid and watching the darkness press against the glass. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me sane through the divorce, through the lonely nights, through all the small failures that had added up to a life I barely recognized, that part was working overtime. Bobcat, it insisted. Fox. Some kind of owl, maybe, doing something weird with its call. Animals made strange sounds all the time. I'd grown up in the country, I knew that. Just because I couldn't identify something didn't mean it was impossible to identify. But there was another part of my brain, older and quieter, that remembered Earl's words about things that belonged to the land before the ranches. Things you didn't look for and didn't talk about. Things you just hoped weren't hungry. I told that part to shut up and poured another cup of coffee. By the time the sun came up, I'd almost convinced myself that nothing had happened. The morning light had a way of making the night's fears seem foolish, childish even. I showered, shaved, ate my usual breakfast of eggs and toast. The routine helped. Routine always helped. I was at the equipment barn by 6:30, earlier than usual, and I threw myself into work with a desperation that probably would have worried me if I'd stopped to think about it. The tractor's hydraulic pump needed replacing. I'd been putting it off because the parts had to come from San Antonio, and Earl hated spending money. But today it seemed like the most important task in the world. Something I could understand. Something I could fix. Tyler showed up around 9, looking like he'd just rolled out of bed, which he probably had. He wandered over to where I was working and stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching me wrestle with a stuck fitting. "You look like hell," he said. "Thanks." I didn't look up. "Granddad says the deer are back at the stock tank. Saw them this morning when he was checking the fence line." That made me pause. "The deer are back?" That's what he said. 6 of them drinking like nothing ever happened. Tyler shrugged. Guess whatever spooked them moved on. I wanted to believe that. God, I wanted to believe that. More than I'd wanted anything in a long time. But the memory of that sound, that deep, wrong howl, was still echoing in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made it hadn't moved on at all. It had just stopped being loud. "You hear anything strange last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Tyler gave me a look. "Like what?" "I don't know. Animal sounds. Something in the brush." Man, I was out like a light. Took some melatonin because I couldn't sleep the night before. Too much coffee, I think. Didn't hear a thing. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling. "Why? You hear something?" I thought about telling him. I really did. But standing there in the morning sunlight, with the smell of grease and diesel and cut grass, the words wouldn't come. What was I going to say? That I'd heard something screaming in the cedar breaks, something that sounded like it was trying to form words? That I'd been so scared I'd locked my door for the first time in 3 years and checked it twice? He'd think I was losing my mind. Hell, I was starting to think I was losing my mind. "Nothing," I said. "Never mind. Pass me that wrench." That afternoon, I drove into town to pick up the parts for the hydraulic pump. The ranch was about 20 miles from the nearest actual town, a place called Fredericksburg, that had transformed over the years from a sleepy German farming community into a tourist destination full of wine-tasting rooms and antique shops. I hated going there on weekends when the city people descended, but on a Wednesday afternoon it was tolerable. The auto parts store was on the outskirts, past the tourist traps, in a strip mall that also housed a feed store and a laundromat. I knew the guy behind the counter, Jerry, a heavy-set man in his 60s who'd been running the place since before I was born. He knew every truck and tractor in 3 counties and could tell you exactly what was wrong with them just from a description of the sound they made. "Fenris," he said when I walked in. "What'd you break this time?" "The hydraulic pump on the old John Deere. Earl finally agreed to replace it instead of patching it again." Jerry whistled. "Must have put a gun to his head. That man's tighter than bark on a tree." He started tapping at his ancient computer. "Got one in the back. Came in yesterday." While he went to retrieve it, I wandered the aisles, looking at nothing in particular. My mind kept drifting back to the tracks at the stock tank, to the corrupted trail camera images, to the eyes in the darkness, eyes that were too high, too forward-facing, too aware. "Hey, Jerry," I said when he came back with a box under his arm. "You hear anything about big dogs in the area? Feral ones, maybe?" He set the box on the counter and gave me a curious look. "Big dogs? How big?" "Big, like really big. Great Dane size or bigger." "Can't say I have. Why?" I shrugged, trying to look casual. "Found some tracks out at the ranch. Canine, but bigger than anything I've ever seen. Figured maybe someone's pet got loose." Jerry scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Haven't heard anything like that. You could check with the animal control folks, but they're useless half the time. Or try the game warden. What's his name? Davidson? He might know if there's something unusual running around." "Yeah, I was thinking about that. Thanks." The game warden's office was in a small building near the county courthouse. I'd met Davidson a few times before. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who'd been patrolling this part of Texas for longer than I'd been alive. He knew the land and the animals that lived on it better than anyone, and if something unusual was out there, he'd probably heard about it. He was in his office when I arrived, sitting behind a desk covered in papers and wildlife magazines, a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up when I knocked on the open door, and his face settled into the expression of mild patience that probably served him well when dealing with the public. "Help you?" "I'm Fenris Ravencrest. Work out at the Holloway Ranch, west of town." "Know the place? What can I do for you?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the pictures I'd taken of the tracks. Found these at our stock tank a few days ago. Any idea what could have made them? Davidson took the phone and squinted at the screen, swiping through the images. His expression didn't change, but I thought I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or concern. But when he handed the phone back, his voice was dismissive. Dog tracks. Big one, sure, but nothing crazy. Probably a feral that's been living off the land. They get big when they don't have to compete with other dogs for food. They're too big for a regular dog, I said, and the stride is wrong. Look at the distance between them. Could be a wolf hybrid. People buy them as pets, think they're cool, then can't handle them and let them go. Happens more often than you'd think. He shrugged. If it's causing problems with your livestock, let me know and I'll set some traps. Otherwise, I wouldn't worry about it. These things usually move on when they realize there's easier pickings somewhere else. I wanted to argue, to show him the camera images with the eyes in the darkness, to tell him about the sound I'd heard, but I could already see the way he was looking at me like I was one of those paranoid city people who moved to the country and freaked out at every coyote howl. He had real problems to deal with. Poaching, illegal hunting, livestock predation. He didn't have time for a mechanic with an overactive imagination. Thanks for your time, I said. Any time, and hey. He caught my arm as I turned to leave. If you do see something, don't try to deal with it yourself. Whatever it is, it's still a wild animal. They're unpredictable. I nodded and left, feeling frustrated and foolish in equal measure. Wolf hybrid? Sure. A wolf hybrid that walked on 2 legs and stood 6 feet tall. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to wonder if maybe Davidson was right. Maybe it was just a big dog, some genetic freak that had grown larger than normal, and I was projecting my own anxiety onto it. The divorce, the isolation, the endless nights of drinking alone on my porch. Maybe it was all catching up to me. Maybe I was seeing monsters where there were only shadows. I drove back to the ranch as the sun started to sink toward the western hills, and I told myself that everything was fine. The deer were back at the stock tank. The coyotes would start howling again any day now. Whatever had been out there had moved on, just like Davidson said. I almost believed it. That night, I made myself sit on the porch. It felt like a test, like I had something to prove, though to whom I couldn't have said. The beer was cold in my hand and the sky was doing its usual hill country sunset show, all oranges and purples and deep bloody reds. A mockingbird was singing in the cedar nearest my trailer, running through its repertoire of stolen songs, and for a while I could pretend that everything was normal. The deer came back. I saw them emerge from the tree line just as the last light was fading, picking their way carefully toward the stock tank. Does mostly, with a few yearlings mixed in. No bucks. It wasn't mating season yet, and the mature males were probably still deeper in the brush, growing their antlers and waiting for fall. I watched them drink, their tails flicking nervously, their heads coming up every few seconds to scan for danger. See, I said out loud. Nothing to worry about, just got yourself spooked over nothing. But even as I said it, I noticed something wrong. The deer were nervous. Not normal nervous, not the usual cautious alertness that prey animals carried with them everywhere. This was different. They were drinking fast, barely pausing to look up, like they were trying to get it over with so they could leave. And they kept glancing toward the same spot in the trees. a dense thicket of cedar about 100 yards from the tank, where the shadows gathered thick and dark. I looked at the thicket. Something looked back. I saw them first. 2 points of amber light, reflecting the last of the sunset. They were in the shadows, just barely visible, and they were too high. Way too high. A deer's eyes would be maybe 3 feet off the ground, 4 if it was a big buck with its head raised. These were at least 6 feet up, maybe more. And they were forward-facing close together, watching the deer at the tank with an intensity that made my stomach drop. The deer bolted. They moved as one, the whole group exploding into motion, white tails flashing as they fled back toward the tree line. In seconds, they were gone, the sound of their hooves fading into the distance. And then there was only silence, that deep, pressing silence that I was starting to know too well. The eyes didn't move. I sat frozen on my porch, my beer forgotten, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The eyes just stayed there, watching. Not the deer anymore, me. They were watching me. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The last of the light drained from the sky, and the eyes seemed to glow brighter in the gathering dark. Amber turning to gold, gold turning to something almost orange. They didn't blink. They didn't waver. They just watched. Then they rose. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first. It looked like the eyes were floating upward, detaching from whatever head they belonged to and drifting toward the sky. But then my brain caught up with my vision, and I realized that whatever was in that thicket was standing up. The eyes went from 6 feet to 7, 7 to 8. They stopped somewhere around 8.5 feet off the ground, and they were still watching me. I was inside my trailer before I realized I'd moved. The beer was gone, dropped in the dirt somewhere between the porch and the door, and I was standing in my kitchen with my back against the far wall, breathing hard, my whole body shaking like I was having a seizure. Not real, I heard myself saying. Not real, not real, not real. But I knew it was real. I knew it the way I knew my own name, the way I knew the sun would rise tomorrow. There was something out there in the cedar breaks, something that stood 8 feet tall and had eyes like amber fire, and it had been watching me. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in my kitchen with all the lights on and the curtains drawn, and I listened to the silence outside my windows. Sometime around midnight, I heard something moving in the brush near my trailer. Slow, heavy footsteps that seemed to circle the building before fading into the distance. I sat there with my hands clenched so tight my knuckles turned white, and I waited for something to break through the door, the windows, the thin metal walls that suddenly seemed about as protective as tissue paper. Nothing came. By morning, I'd half convinced myself again that I was imagining things. Trauma did strange things to the mind, I knew that. Isolation made it worse. And I'd been isolating myself for years, cutting off friends and family, drinking alone in the dark. Maybe this was just my brain's way of forcing me to confront everything I'd been avoiding. But then I went outside and saw the tracks in the dirt near my porch. They were the same tracks I'd found at the stock tank, canine but massive, with deep claw marks and an impossible stride. They circled my trailer in a perfect ring, coming within a few feet of my front steps, and they were fresh. Made sometime in the night while I was sitting inside, terrified, listening to something walk around my home. I took pictures with shaking hands, then stood there looking at the tree line in the morning light. The cedars looked normal now, just trees and shadows and the occasional flash of a bird's wing. But I knew better. I knew that something was in there, something that was watching me, waiting for what? I didn't know. And that was maybe the worst part. I worked that day like a man possessed. I threw myself into the tractor repair, my hands moving automatically while my mind churned. The new hydraulic pump went in smoothly, and by noon the old John Deere was running better than it had in years. But I barely noticed. I kept thinking about the eyes in the darkness, the footsteps circling my trailer, the impossible height of whatever had stood up in that thicket. I needed to talk to someone. I needed to tell someone what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I was starting to suspect. But who? Tyler would laugh at me. Davidson already thought I was paranoid. And Earl. Earl had talked about things that belonged to the land before the ranches. Things his grandfather had warned him about. I found the old man on his porch that afternoon, sitting in his father's rocking chair with a glass of iced tea, sweating in his hand. The dogs were at his feet, all three of them, and they watched me approach with something that looked almost like sympathy. "Earl," I said, "I need to talk to you." He didn't seem surprised. "Figured you would sooner or later. Sit down." I took the chair next to him, an old wicker thing that creaked under my weight. For a moment we just sat there looking out at the pastures, at the cattle grazing in the distance, at the line of cedars that marked the edge of the wild land. "I've seen it," I said finally. "Or something. Eyes in the trees, tracks around my trailer. Heard it too the other night. Making sounds that..." I stopped, not sure how to describe what I'd heard. That didn't sound right. Earl nodded slowly, still not looking at me. "My grandfather saw one once, or said he did. He was a man of few words, not given to flights of fancy. When he told me about it, he was 83 years old, and he'd never mentioned it before. Said it happened when he was a young man, barely 18, riding fence on the back section of what's now my north pasture." I waited, not daring to interrupt. He said it was standing at the tree line, watching him. "Big," he said. "Bigger than a man, bigger than any animal he'd ever seen. He thought it was a bear at first. There used to be black bears in these hills, back before the ranchers killed them all off. But then it stood up on its hind legs, and it wasn't a bear." "Bears don't stand like that," he said. "Bears don't have eyes like that. And bears don't watch you like they're trying to figure out if you're worth eating." What did he do? He rode away, didn't look back, didn't tell anyone for 65 years. Earl finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were the eyes of an old man who'd seen more than he wanted to, and knew he'd see more before the end. He said the worst part was the way it just let him go, like it could have caught him if it wanted to, easy, but it didn't. He spent the rest of his life wondering why. I thought about the eyes in the thicket, watching me. The tracks circling my trailer but never coming to the door. The scream in the night that sounded almost like words. "What is it?" I asked. "Did your grandfather ever say?" Earl shook his head. "Some things don't have names. Or if they do, we've forgotten them. All I know is what he told me. You don't look for them, you don't talk about them, and you hope they're not hungry." He took a sip of his tea, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass. "And if you see one, you don't stick around to get a better look." I thought about the trail camera, about my plans to catch whatever was out there on film. Suddenly, that seemed like a very bad idea. I drove back to my trailer as the sun started to set, and I told myself I was just going to pack a bag, maybe spend the night in town at the motel. Just for a few days, just until I could figure out what to do. I wasn't running, I was being prudent. there was a difference. The trailer felt different when I walked in. Smaller somehow. More fragile. I grabbed a duffel bag from my closet and started throwing clothes into it. Jeans, t-shirts, socks, underwear. The basics. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting out before dark, getting somewhere with lights and people and walls that were more substantial than corrugated metal. I was zipping up the bag when I heard a sound outside. It wasn't the scream I'd heard before. It was something else. A low rhythmic sound, like breath being pushed through a very large set of lungs. Heavy, wet, coming from somewhere near the porch. I froze, my hands still on the bag zipper, not daring to move. The sound continued, slow and steady, and underneath it I could hear something else. A soft padding, like feet on dirt. Large feet, getting closer. I looked at the window above my kitchen sink. The curtains were open just a crack, and through that crack I could see the last light of day fading into purple twilight, and I could see something else. A shape, moving past the window. Massive. Wrong. I only caught a glimpse, a fraction of a second, of something silhouetted against the dying light. But that glimpse was enough to burn into my brain, to brand itself there forever. It was tall. Taller than me, taller than any man I'd ever seen. Its shoulders were too wide, its arms too long, hanging past where its knees should have been. And its legs bent the wrong way, backward at the knee, like a dog's hind legs scaled up to impossible size. It moved with a hunched, loping gait that covered ground faster than it had any right to. And as it passed my window, it turned its head, just slightly, and I saw its profile against the sky. The snout was long and narrow, like a wolf's, but stretched out, distorted. The ears were pointed and set high on the skull. And the eyes, even in profile, I could see the glow of them, amber fading to orange, reflecting the last light of the dying sun. Then it was past my window, gone into the darkness on the other side of my trailer, and I was alone again. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember grabbing my keys or running to my truck or starting the engine. The next thing I knew, I was tearing down the ranch road at 70 miles an hour, my headlights cutting through the darkness, my hands gripping the wheel so tight I could feel the leather pressing into my palms. The main house was a mile and a half away. I made it in less than a minute, fishtailing into the gravel driveway and slamming the truck into park before the wheels had even stopped spinning. Earl's dogs started barking the second my door opened and lights came on inside the house. Earl met me on the porch with a shotgun in his hands and a look on his face that said he already knew. "Get inside," he said. I didn't argue. I followed him into the living room, where the lights were on and the curtains were drawn and a fire was burning in the fireplace, despite the fact that it was still 60 degrees outside. Earl handed me a glass of something amber. Whiskey, I realized when I took a sip. Good whiskey. I drained it in one swallow and held out the glass for more. "What did you see?" he asked. I told him everything. The eyes in the thicket, the tracks around my trailer, the sound outside my window, the silhouette passing in the twilight. Earl listened without interrupting, his own glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, his face grave and still. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You can stay here tonight. The guest room's made up. In the morning, we'll talk about what comes next." What comes next? I heard the edge of hysteria in my own voice and didn't care. What the hell is out there, Earl? What am I supposed to do about whatever that thing is? Earl looked at me with something that might have been pity, might have been understanding. "Nothing," he said. "You don't do anything. You stay inside when the sun goes down. You don't go looking for it. You don't try to prove it's real. You just keep your head down and hope it moves on. And if it doesn't," he didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was answer enough. I spent that night in Earl's guest room, but I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the old house creak and settle around me, listening to the dogs padding up and down the hallway, listening to the silence outside the windows, that terrible pressing silence that meant something was wrong, something was out there. Sometime around 3 a.m, I heard it again. The scream, coming from somewhere far away, maybe a mile or more, but still clear in the stillness of the night. It rose and fell, that deep and terrible sound, and underneath it I could almost hear words. Not English, not any language I recognized, but words nonetheless, meaning trying to claw its way through the barrier between their world and mine. The dogs started howling, all 3 of them, their voices rising in a chorus of fear and defiance. I heard Earl's footsteps in the hall, heavy and slow, and then his voice, calm and quiet, soothing them. The scream cut off. The silence returned. And somewhere in the cedar breaks, something that stood 8 feet tall and walked on legs that bent the wrong way was watching. Waiting. For what, I still didn't know. But I was starting to think I didn't want to find out. The morning came gray and cold, the first real chill of autumn settling over the hill country, like a shroud. I must have dozed off sometime after 5 because I woke to the sound of Earl's coffee pot percolating in the kitchen and the smell of bacon frying on the stove. Did these normal sounds, safe sounds, but they couldn't erase what I'd heard in the night, what I'd seen in the days before. That scream was still echoing in my head, those amber eyes still burning behind my eyelids every time I blinked. I found Earl at the kitchen table with a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him, a cup of black coffee steaming at his elbow. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Dark circles under his eyes, a grayness to his skin that hadn't been there before. His dogs were huddled under the table at his feet, pressed together like they were drawing comfort from each other's warmth. They barely looked up when I walked in. "Coffee's on the counter," Earl said. "Help yourself to breakfast." Marlene made extra before she went to her sister's. I poured myself a cup and sat down across from him, but I couldn't bring myself to eat. My stomach was a tight knot of anxiety, and every time I thought about food, I thought about that silhouette I'd seen, the way it had moved, the way its legs had bent backward at the knee, the way it had turned its head toward my truck, as if it could see me through the darkness. "Marlene left?" I asked. Earl nodded. "Called her sister in Fredericksburg this morning. Told her she needed to visit for a few days." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "She didn't ask why. She didn't have to. We've been married 43 years. She knows when something's wrong." "And Tyler?" "Sent him into town for supplies. Told him to take his time, maybe stay the night with his girlfriend." Earl set down his cup and looked at me. Really looked at me, for the first time since I'd walked in. "I wanted to talk to you alone, Fenris. About what you saw, about what's been happening." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You know what it is?" "I know what my grandfather called them. I know what the old-timers used to say, back before the ranches, before the fences and the roads and the people who came from somewhere else and thought they knew better than the land." Earl's voice was low, almost a whisper. There are things in these hills that were here before us, things that learned to hide when the world changed, but they never left. They just waited. Waited for what? Earl shook his head. I don't know, nobody does. Maybe they were waiting for the right time. Maybe they were waiting for the people who remembered them to die off. Maybe they were just waiting because that's what they do, wait and watch and decide if the new people are worth their attention. I thought about the eyes I'd seen in the thicket, the way they'd blinked independently, the way they'd tracked my movement across the pasture with an intelligence that felt almost human. They've been watching me. Seems like. Why me? There are a dozen other people on this ranch. Why single me out? Earl was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. Resignation, maybe, or something older and darker. I don't know, Fenris. Could be because you're alone out there on the back 40. Could be because you noticed them first. Saw their tracks. Put up that camera. Could be they just decided you were interesting. He paused. My grandfather used to say they were drawn to people who paid attention. People who looked too close. I felt sick. All those nights on my porch, staring out at the tree line, watching for deer that never came. All those mornings, checking the trail camera, studying the tracks in the mud, trying to figure out what was wrong. I'd been looking for them without even knowing what I was looking for, and they'd been looking back. What do I do? I asked. How do I make them stop? Earl's laugh was bitter and humorless. You don't. You can't make them do anything. They're not animals you can scare off or predators you can hunt down. They're something else. Something older. The best you can hope for is that they lose interest and move on. And if they don't? Earl didn't answer. He just looked at me with those tired, haunted eyes, and I understood. If they didn't lose interest, there was nothing anyone could do. Not Earl, not me. Not all the shotguns and rifles in the Texas Hill Country combined. I stayed at Earl's house for most of the morning, nursing cups of coffee and pretending to read an old hunting magazine while the dogs paced nervously around the living room. Every time one of them paused at a window, my heart would jump into my throat, and I'd find myself straining to see past the curtains, looking for shapes in the tree line that didn't belong there. Around noon, Earl told me I should go back to my trailer. You can't stay here forever, he said, not unkindly, and running will only make it worse. Whatever's out there, it knows where you live. Moving won't change that. The best thing you can do is keep your head down, go about your business, and wait for it to pass. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to say that going back to that trailer, that isolated single wide sitting alone on the back 40 with nothing but cedar breaks and silence all around it, was the stupidest thing I could possibly do. But what was the alternative? Flee to Austin to my ex-wife's house and bring whatever was following me straight to my daughter's doorstep? No, Earl was right. Whatever happened, I had to face it here. The drive back to my trailer was the longest mile and a half of my life. In the daylight, everything looked normal. The live oaks, spreading their gnarled branches over the road. The cedar breaks, standing dark and dense on either side. The stock tank glittering in the autumn sun. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that eyes were tracking my truck's progress through the landscape, measuring my movements, cataloging my habits. My trailer looked exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. There were tracks on my porch. I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at them through the windshield, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had gone white. They were the same tracks I'd found near the stock tank. Canine but wrong. Massive and deep and spaced too far apart. Something had climbed onto my porch during the night, had stood at my door while I was a mile and a half away in Earl's guest room, listening to screams in the darkness. Had it tried the door? Had it pressed its face to my windows, peering in at my empty bed, my cold coffee maker, my rifle propped uselessly against the wall? I got out of the truck eventually. I had to. I couldn't sit there forever, paralyzed by fear, waiting for something to happen. But I kept my rifle in my hands as I approached the porch, and I cleared every corner like I was back in Afghanistan, half expecting something to come lunging out of the shadows at any moment. The tracks led from the tree line to my porch, circled the trailer twice, then disappeared back into the cedar breaks. Whatever had made them had been thorough in its investigation. I found scratches on my windows, long parallel lines that might have been made by claws dragging across the glass. I found a tuft of coarse gray-brown fur caught on a nail near my door, and when I picked it up, it felt wrong in my hand. Too thick, too coarse, like nothing I'd ever touched before. I went inside and locked the door behind me. The next 3 days were the worst of my life. I worked during the daylight hours, forcing myself to maintain some semblance of normalcy, replacing a fuel pump on one of the ranch trucks, welding a broken hinge on the barn door, all the routine maintenance that kept the Holloway operation running. But I was barely there, my mind constantly wandering to the cedar breaks at the edge of every field, the dark spaces between the live oaks, the shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Earl avoided me, or maybe I avoided him. Either way, we didn't talk about what was happening, didn't acknowledge the thing that was growing in the silence between us. Tyler came back from town and made a few jokes about me looking like death warmed over, but something in my face must have told him not to push it, because he backed off quickly and left me alone. The nights were worse. I didn't sleep, not really. I dozed in my recliner with the lights on and my rifle across my lap, jerking awake at every sound, every creak of the trailer settling on its foundation, every rustle of wind in the cedar outside my windows. And every night, sometime between midnight and 3 a.m, I would hear it. Not the scream this time. Something worse. Breathing. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing just outside my trailer walls. The sound of massive lungs filling and emptying, patient and steady and impossibly close. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the wind. The second time I thought it was my own breathing, amplified by panic and sleeplessness into something monstrous. But by the third night, I knew what it was. It was watching me. It was waiting. On the fourth night, I finally saw it clearly. I was on my porch. Stupid, I know, but the walls of my trailer had started to feel like a coffin, and I needed to breathe air that didn't taste like fear and sweat and coffee gone cold. The moon was full or nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows across the pasture, and I told myself that was enough. Told myself nothing would approach with that much light, that much visibility. I was wrong. I saw the movement first, something shifting at the edge of the cedar breaks, maybe 200 yards out. I raised my rifle without thinking, pressing my eye to the scope, adjusting the focus until the tree line came into sharp relief. And there it was. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know that whatever I was looking at wasn't any animal I'd ever heard of. Wasn't anything that belonged in the catalog of earthly predators I'd spent my whole life learning. It was standing at the edge of the trees, one hand, not paw, hand, gripping a cedar trunk for balance. The hand was huge, easily twice the size of mine, with long fingers that ended in black claws curved like fish hooks. The fur on its arm was gray-brown and patchy, matted in places like it had been wet recently, and the skin underneath was pale, almost human in color. I followed the arm up to a shoulder that was too broad, too heavily muscled, bunched and knotted in ways that no canine anatomy could explain. And above the shoulder, emerging from the shadow of the cedars, was a face, a snout. Long and narrow like a wolf's, but longer, more exaggerated, with a ridge of bone running up between the eyes that gave it an almost reptilian look. The snout was slightly open, and I could see teeth, yellow and thick and curved inward, designed for gripping, for holding, for tearing. But the eyes were the worst part. They were amber, the same amber I'd seen in the thicket that first night, the same amber that had haunted my dreams for the past week. But seeing them clearly, seeing them set in that impossible face, was different. They weren't animal eyes, they weren't human eyes either. They were something else, something that carried an intelligence I couldn't begin to understand, an awareness that felt older than language, older than thought. The creature was looking at me, not just looking, studying, evaluating, making calculations that I couldn't fathom, reaching conclusions that I would never know. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me on my porch with my rifle raised and my finger frozen on the trigger, it at the tree line with its hand on the cedar and its eyes locked on mine. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like hours. It felt like no time at all. Then its snout pulled back. It wasn't a snarl, not exactly. It was something else, a smile, maybe, or the closest thing to a smile that a face like that could produce. A baring of teeth that wasn't threat but acknowledgement, recognition, confirmation. It knew me. It had been watching me for weeks, learning my routines, cataloging my habits, studying me the way a hunter studies prey. And now it was letting me know. Now it was showing itself, revealing just enough to make sure I understood. I was being hunted. The creature released its grip on the cedar trunk and took a step back, then another, its massive form retreating into the shadows of the trees. In the moonlight, I could see its legs now, bent backward at the knee like a dog's, but longer, more powerful, built for running and leaping and chasing down prey across rough terrain. It moved without sound. No rustle of leaves, no crack of twigs, no whisper of fur against bark. It simply faded into the darkness, those amber eyes glowing for one moment longer before they too winked out. And I was alone on my porch with my rifle and my terror and the certain knowledge that everything had changed. I went inside. I locked the door. I pushed my refrigerator in front of it, then my bookshelf, then everything else I could move, building a barricade that I knew wouldn't stop anything, but that made me feel marginally less exposed. Then I sat in my recliner with my rifle across my lap and waited for dawn. The next morning I found something on my porch that turned my blood to ice. My trail camera. The one I'd set up near the stock tank 3 weeks ago. The one that had captured nothing but corrupted footage and darkness and those 2 glowing points of light. It was sitting on my welcome mat, propped up against my door like a package delivered in the night. It had been torn apart. The housing was cracked, the lens shattered, the SD card slot empty. Deep gouges ran across the plastic shell. Claw marks, I realized, the same parallel lines I'd seen on my windows. Whatever had destroyed it had done so deliberately, methodically, making sure nothing could be salvaged. And underneath the camera, pinned in place by its weight, was a piece of paper. My piece of paper. The printout I'd made of the corrupted footage, the one I'd shoved in my junk drawer and tried to forget about. It had been in my trailer, in my drawer, in my home. Something had been inside while I slept. I don't remember picking up the paper or going back inside or sitting down at my kitchen table with my head in my hands. The next thing I knew, hours had passed. The sun had moved across the sky, and my coffee had gone cold in its cup. My rifle was on the table in front of me, fully loaded, safety off. But it felt useless now. What good was a rifle against something that could enter my home without me knowing? What good was any weapon against a creature that moved without sound and watched without being seen and left messages to let me know it could reach me anytime it wanted? I tried to call Earl, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice before I managed to dial his number. It rang and rang and rang, and when his voicemail picked up, I hung up without leaving a message. What would I say? That something had been in my trailer while I slept? That it had gone through my things, found my evidence, destroyed it, and left it on my doorstep like a cat leaving a dead bird? He would think I'd finally lost my mind. Maybe I had. I tried calling my daughter next. Sophie was 12 now, living with her mother in Austin, and I talked to her every Sunday without fail. But this wasn't Sunday, and when I heard her voice on the other end of the line, "Dad? What's wrong? Are you okay?" I couldn't make myself speak. I just sat there listening to her breathe, drinking in the sound of something normal and safe and human, until she started to sound scared, and I forced out some lie about pocket dialing her by accident. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. "You sound weird." "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired. I'll call you Sunday, okay?" "Okay, love you, Dad." "Love you too." I hung up and stared at my phone for a long time, thinking about Sophie, thinking about her mother, thinking about the life I'd left behind when the marriage fell apart. 2 years ago, I'd thought that coming to the Holloway Ranch was an escape, a chance to start over, to find some peace in the isolation and the silence and the work. Now I understood that I'd walked into something I couldn't escape, something that had been waiting in the cedar breaks long before I arrived and would be waiting long after I was gone, if I was allowed to leave at all. That afternoon, I tried to find help. I drove into town, to the county sheriff's office, and stood in the lobby for 20 minutes, trying to figure out what to say. Davidson, the game warden, had been dismissive, so I decided to try local law enforcement instead. The deputy on duty was named Marcos, and he met me in the parking lot with a cup of coffee in his hand and a look of polite skepticism on his face. "Ravencrest, right? The mechanic out at the Holloway place?" He sipped his coffee. "Still seeing things?" "Something's been coming onto my property," I said. I found tracks on my porch, scratches on my windows. Something got into my trailer while I slept." Marcos's expression didn't change. "You file a report?" "I'm trying to file one now." "For what? Breaking and entering by an unknown animal?" He shook his head. "Look, I understand you're spooked. You're living alone out there, no neighbors for miles, and the isolation can get to a person. But there's nothing in these hills that's going to break into your trailer Mountain lions don't do that. Neither do dogs or coyotes or anything else. This isn't a mountain lion? Then what is it? I opened my mouth to answer and found that I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen something that walked on two legs with backward bending knees? That it had hands instead of paws and eyes that glowed amber in the dark? That it smiled at me, smiled, from the edge of the cedar breaks, like it knew exactly who I was and what I was afraid of? He would have me committed, or laugh in my face, or both. I don't know, I said finally, but it's real, and it's been watching me. Marcos sighed and set down his coffee. Tell you what, I'll drive out there tomorrow, take a look around. If there's something leaving tracks on your property, I'll see what I can find. Fair enough? It wasn't fair. It wasn't anywhere close to fair, but it was all I was going to get. So I nodded and thanked him and drove back to the ranch with the taste of failure bitter in my mouth. That night, I didn't stay in my trailer. I parked my truck at the edge of the back pasture, about a quarter mile from the single wide, and settled in to watch. I told myself I was being smart, being tactical, that if something was coming into my home at night, I needed to know when and how and from which direction. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't stand to be inside those walls anymore. Couldn't stand to lie there in the dark wondering if something was standing just outside my door, breathing slow and patient and hungry. Better to be out here, in the open where I could see it coming. The moon was waning now, maybe 3/4 full, and the light it cast across the pasture was dim and silvery and full of shadows. I kept my rifle across my lap and my windows cracked open just enough to hear, and I waited. Hours passed. The silence was absolute. No insects, no coyotes, no owls calling from the live oaks. Just the whisper of wind in the cedar breaks and the occasional creak of my truck settling on its springs and the endless oppressive weight of the darkness. And then, sometime after 2 a.m, I heard it, movement. Not near my trailer, farther out, toward the stock tank, maybe 150 yards from where I sat. I raised my rifle and pressed my eye to the scope, scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of motion among the cedars. There, 2 shapes emerged from the brush, moving with a grace that defied their size. In the dim moonlight, I could barely make out their forms. Massive, hunched, walking upright on legs that bent backward at the knee. Their shoulders were impossibly wide, their arms hanging loose at their sides, and even at this distance I could see the gleam of their claws, long and black and curved. They were dragging something between them. A deer. A buck, I realized. 8 points at least. Its rack scraping against the ground as they hauled it through the grass. The buck was gutted, its belly split open and its entrails trailing behind it. And the creatures moved with terrible efficiency, sharing the weight without apparent effort. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I could only watch through my scope as they passed within 100 yards of my position, close enough that I could see details I hadn't noticed before. The way their fur lay flat and wet against their bodies, the way their ears twitched and swiveled independently, the way their muzzles wrinkled back over their teeth when they scented the air. Then one of them stopped. It turned its head slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at my truck. Those amber eyes found mine through the scope, and I felt something cold and ancient and unspeakably malevolent wash over me like a wave. The creature's lips pulled back, and I saw that terrible smile again. That baring of teeth that wasn't threat but acknowledgement. It knew I was there. It knew I was watching. And it didn't care. The creature held my gaze for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, and then it turned away and continued on its path, dragging the gutted buck into the darkness of the cedar breaks. Its companion followed without looking back, and within moments they had vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but a trail of blood and disturbed grass. I sat in my truck until dawn, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but replay that moment over and over in my mind. The way it had looked at me, the way it had smiled, the way it had recognized me, acknowledged me, dismissed me, all in a single glance. I wasn't prey, I was something worse. I was entertainment. The next week was a blur of fear and exhaustion and growing desperation. Deputy Marcos came out to the ranch like he'd promised. Spent an hour poking around my trailer and the surrounding area and found nothing. No tracks, no scratches, no evidence that anything had ever been there at all. "Sorry, Ravencrest," he said, standing in my doorway with his hat in his hands. "Whatever you saw, it's not leaving any sign behind. Maybe you should consider taking some time off. Get away for a while, clear your head." I didn't argue with him. There was no point. Whatever was hunting me was smart enough to cover its tracks when it wanted to remain invisible when it suited its purposes. It had shown itself to me. Let me see its eyes, its hands, its smile, because it wanted me to know. Because the fear was part of the game. After Marcos left, I tried to work, I really did. I went through the motions of my job, fixing engines and replacing parts and maintaining the equipment that kept the Holloway ranch running, but my heart wasn't in it. My mind kept drifting to the cedar breaks at the edge of every field, to the stock tank where the deer no longer came, to the memory of those 2 shapes dragging their kill into the darkness. Earl noticed. Of course he did. "You're not sleeping," he said one afternoon, finding me slumped against my truck in the barn, half asleep on my feet. "And you're not eating. You keep going like this, you're going to collapse." "I can't sleep," I said. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them." "Them? There are 2, at least 2. I saw them a few nights ago out by the stock tank. They were dragging a buck between them, walking upright, like it was nothing." I laughed, and the sound was jagged and broken. "They smiled at me, Earl. One of them looked right at me and smiled." Earl was quiet for a long moment. Then he put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed, and his grip was warm and solid and real. "Come stay at the house tonight," he said. "Marlene's still at her sister's, and Tyler's been bunking with his girlfriend, more often than not. I've got room. You shouldn't be alone out there." I should have said yes. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say yes, to get out of that trailer, to put walls and distance and other human beings between me and the things in the cedar breaks. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I was too proud. Maybe I was too stubborn. Maybe some part of me still believed that I could handle this, that if I just held on a little longer, they would lose interest and move on and leave me alone. Or maybe I knew, on some level too deep for words, that it didn't matter where I went. They had found me. They were watching me. And running wouldn't change that. "Thanks," I said, "but I'll be okay. I just need to get through this." Earl looked at me with something that might have been sadness, might have been resignation. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess you do?" That night I returned to my trailer for what I didn't know would be the last time. The sun was setting when I pulled up, painting the cedar breaks in shades of orange and red and deep, bloody purple. And as I climbed out of my truck, I felt the silence settle over me like a shroud. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just the silence. And somewhere in that silence, hidden in the shadows of the cedars, 2 pairs of amber eyes were watching, waiting, getting ready. I went inside and locked the door behind me. I pushed my furniture against the walls. I loaded my rifle and sat down in my recliner and prepared to face whatever was coming, because I knew, with a certainty that went beyond thought or reason, that it was coming. Tonight, tomorrow, sometime soon. The game was almost over, and I was running out of time. They came at midnight. I'd been sitting in that recliner for almost 6 hours, my rifle across my lap, my eyes fixed on the windows, where the darkness pressed against the glass like something solid. The propane heater hissed softly in the corner, but the warmth it produced couldn't touch the cold that had settled into my bones. I was exhausted. 3 days without real sleep will do that to a man. But every time my eyelids started to droop, every time the darkness threatened to pull me under, some instinct would jerk me back awake, heart pounding, hands tightening on the rifle. The silence outside was absolute. No coyotes, no owls, no nighttime rustling of deer moving through the brush. Just nothing. A void where sound should have been, and in that void I could feel them out there, circling, patient, waiting for the moment when my guard finally dropped. When they finally made their move, they didn't bother with subtlety. The first impact hit the trailer like a wrecking ball, slamming into the wall hard enough to knock pictures from their hooks and send my coffee cup crashing to the floor. The whole structure shuddered, metal groaning, and I was on my feet before the sound had finished echoing, rifle up, finger on the trigger. The second hit came from the opposite side, and this time I heard it, the shriek of claws tearing through aluminum siding, peeling it back like tissue paper. Cold night air rushed in through the gap, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach heave. Copper and rot and something underneath, something animal and wrong, like the musk of a predator that had never evolved to exist. I fired through the wall without thinking, the rifle kicking against my shoulder, the flash lighting up the trailer's interior in a strobe of white and orange. Something outside screamed, not in pain, I realized, with dawning horror, but in what sounded almost like laughter. They were playing with me. The third impact hit the door, and this time the furniture I'd stacked against it wasn't enough. The barricade exploded inward, my couch tumbling end over end, the bookshelf shattering against the opposite wall, and through the ruined doorway came something that my mind simply refused to process. It had to duck to fit through the frame, its shoulders scraping against both sides, and when it straightened to its full height, its head nearly brushed the ceiling. 8 feet tall, maybe more, with a body that looked like someone had taken a man and a wolf and forced them together without caring about the seams. Its legs were wrong, bent backward at the knee, like a dog's hind legs, but longer, more muscled, ending in feet that were somewhere between paw and hand, with black claws that gouged furrows in my linoleum floor. Its arms hung past its knees, thick with corded muscle, and its hands, God, its hands, were almost human. 5 fingers tipped with claws that had to be 4 inches long, curved like scythes. But it was the face that broke something in me. The snout was elongated, lupine, filled with teeth that gleamed yellow in the light from my overturned lamp. The ears were pointed, laid back against a skull that was too large, shaped wrong, with a forehead that bulged in a way that suggested intelligence, awareness, understanding. And the eyes, those amber eyes that had watched me from the darkness, that had tracked me across the ranch, that had stared at me from above that terrible smile, they weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of something that knew exactly what it was doing. something that enjoyed it. The fur that covered its body was patchy, matted, gray-brown in places and almost black in others. And through the gaps I could see skin that was pale and smooth and horrifyingly human. Scars crisscrossed its torso, old wounds, long healed. And as it moved into the trailer, its muscles shifted beneath that patchwork coat in ways that made my gorge rise. It smiled at me. The same smile I'd seen at the stock tank. The same terrible expression of recognition and amusement and hunger, and when it opened its mouth, what came out wasn't a growl or a snarl or any sound an animal should make. It was a word. Run. The voice was wrong, too deep, too guttural, shaped by a throat that wasn't designed for human speech. But the meaning was clear. A command, a suggestion, an invitation to play the game the way it wanted. I fired. The bullet caught it in the shoulder, spinning it half around, and dark blood splattered across my kitchen cabinets. It didn't fall. It didn't even seem particularly bothered. It just turned back to face me, that smile widening, and took another step forward. Behind me, glass shattered. I didn't think. I dove sideways, rolling under my kitchen table, and the second creature's claws missed my back by inches. It crashed through the window it had broken, all 8 feet of it somehow fitting through a space that should have been too small. And when it landed in my trailer, the floor buckled under its weight. 2 of them. In my trailer, with me. I scrambled backward, firing again, the rifle's report deafening in the enclosed space. The second creature took the round in its chest and stumbled, and I used that moment to bolt for the door. The ruined door, the door that the first creature had torn open. A clawed hand caught my shoulder and spun me around. The first creature held me like I weighed nothing, one hand wrapped around my upper arm, claws digging into my flesh, through my jacket. The pain was distant, muted by adrenaline and terror, but I could feel the blood starting to flow, hot and wet against my skin. It pulled me close, close enough that I could see the individual hairs on its snout, close enough that its breath washed over my face in a wave of rotting meat and copper. Those amber eyes studied me, and in them I saw something that scared me more than the teeth, more than the claws, more than anything else about this nightmare-made flesh. I saw curiosity, I saw interest, I saw a mind working behind that monstrous face, evaluating me, measuring me, deciding something. The second creature moved up beside its companion, blood still leaking from the wound in its chest, and it made a sound, a series of growls and yips, and something that might have been words, in a language I couldn't understand. The first creature responded in kind, and for a long moment they communicated over my head while I hung in that iron grip, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. Then the first creature looked back at me. Its smile had changed, shifted into something that might have been approval, might have been disappointment, might have been nothing I had any framework to interpret. It let me go. I dropped to the floor, my legs too weak to hold me, and the 2 creatures stepped back. The second one was already moving toward the ruined window, and the first lingered just long enough to look at me one last time, to make sure I understood. They weren't hunting me. They never had been. I was a distraction, a curiosity, a toy they'd played with when the mood struck them. And now they were bored. Now they were done. Now they were leaving me alive for reasons I would never understand. And somehow that was worse than if they'd killed me. The first creature ducked through my door and vanished into the night. I heard them moving through the darkness, heading toward the cedar breaks. And then the silence returned, absolute and complete. I lay on my floor in the wreckage of my life and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember how to breathe. The drive to Earl's house took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. My shoulder was still bleeding, the claw marks deep enough that I could feel them grinding against bone every time I turned the wheel, and my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly drove off the road twice. The darkness outside my headlights was absolute, impenetrable, and I kept expecting to see eyes reflecting back at me from the trees, kept expecting to hear that terrible laughter again. But there was nothing. Just the road and the darkness and the memory of what had happened, playing on an endless loop in my head. Earl was awake when I pulled up. He was standing on the porch with a shotgun in his hands, and when he saw me stagger out of my truck, blood soaking through my jacket, he didn't ask questions. He just helped me inside and sat me down at the kitchen table and started cleaning my wounds with hands that were steady and sure. "Jesus Christ," he said, looking at the claw marks. "What did this to you?" I told him. All of it. The eyes in the darkness, the shapes at the stock tank, the creatures in my trailer, and the word one of them had spoken, the way they had let me go. I talked until my throat was raw and my voice was hoarse, and when I finished, Earl just sat there looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You need a hospital," he said finally. "I need to get out of here." He didn't argue. He bandaged my shoulder with supplies from a first aid kit that was older than I was, gave me a clean shirt to replace the bloody one, and walked me back out to my truck. The sky was starting to lighten in the east, and in that gray pre-dawn light, the ranch looked almost normal, almost safe. "Where will you go?" Earl asked. "San Antonio. I've got a cousin there. I can stay with him until I figure things out." Earl nodded slowly. "What about your things? Your trailer?" "Keep 'em, burn them, I don't care." I climbed into my truck and gripped the steering wheel and tried to stop my hands from shaking. "I'm not going back there, Earl. Not ever." He stood there watching as I started the engine, and just before I put the truck in gear, he leaned in through the window. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said quietly, "about things that lived in these hills before the ranches, before the settlers, before anyone. Things that were here when the land was wild and never left. He said they had rules, their own rules, and if you respected those rules, they'd leave you alone." He paused, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. I always thought they were just stories. I looked at him for a long moment, and this old rancher who'd spent his whole life on this land, who'd probably seen things he'd never spoken about to anyone. "They let me go," I said. "I don't know why, but they let me go, and I'm not going to stick around to find out if they change their minds." Earl stepped back from the truck. "Can't say I blame you. You take care of yourself, Fenris, and for what it's worth, I believe you." I drove away from the Holloway ranch as the sun rose over the cedar breaks, and I never looked back. Deputy Marcos called me 3 times over the next week. I let all of them go to voicemail. He left messages, concerned at first, then irritated, then finally resigned. The last one just said, "If you're not going to press charges or file a report, there's nothing I can do. But call me if you change your mind." I never called him back. What would I have said? That I was attacked by werewolves in my trailer? That 2 creatures out of a nightmare had held me in their claws and let me go because I was boring? He already thought I was losing my mind. A story like that would just confirm it. Earl called too, once, to let me know he'd had Tyler go through my trailer and box up anything worth keeping. Said he'd send it down to San Antonio when I was ready. I thanked him and gave him my cousin's address and never heard from him again. I don't blame him. Some things are better left unspoken. My cousin Miguel thought I'd finally cracked up. He'd met Marlene a few times, knew about the divorce, knew I'd been struggling. When I showed up on his doorstep looking like I hadn't slept in a week, with wounds on my shoulder that I refused to explain, he assumed the worst. Some kind of breakdown, maybe a suicide attempt, maybe just too much drinking and a fall. I let him believe it. It was easier than the truth. I stayed on his couch for 2 weeks while I got my bearings. Found a job at a Jiffy Lube on the south side of the city, which was humiliating but practical. I could do oil changes in my sleep, and the work didn't require any thought. Found an apartment on the second floor of a complex with good security and motion sensor lights on every balcony. Started going to church on Sundays. Not because I'd found faith, but because churches felt safe, felt protected, felt like places where things like what I'd seen in the cedar breaks couldn't follow. My ex-wife called once, about 3 months after I left the ranch. She'd heard from someone that I'd quit my job and moved to San Antonio, and she wanted to know if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just needed a change of scenery, needed to be closer to civilization. She didn't believe me. I could hear it in her voice. But she didn't push. We talked about Sophie, about school, about normal things, and when we hung up, I felt like a fraud. Sophie noticed the change. Of course she did. Kids always notice more than we give them credit for. "You sound different, Daddy," she said during one of our Sunday calls about 6 months after I'd moved. "You sound sad." "I'm okay, sweetheart, just tired." "Are you scared of something?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat there in my apartment with the phone pressed to my ear and the curtains drawn against the darkness outside, and tried to find words that weren't lies. "Everyone gets scared sometimes," I finally said, "but I'm working on it." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, baby girl." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on and watched the motion sensor lights on my balcony, waiting for them to trigger, waiting for eyes to appear in the darkness. They didn't. They never did. But the fear never went away either. It's been 14 months now since I left the Holloway ranch. 14 months since I watched those 2 creatures drag that buck into the darkness. 14 months since one of them held me in its grip and let me go, and I still don't know why. I've looked sometimes, late at night, when the fear gets too big to ignore. I search the internet for stories like mine, encounters with things that shouldn't exist, creatures that walk on 2 legs and watch with intelligent eyes. There are plenty of them out there, more than I would have expected. People who've seen things in the woods, in the hills, in the dark places where civilization hasn't quite reached. Most of them aren't believed either. Some nights I dream about them. I'm back in my trailer, and the door explodes inward, and those amber eyes are staring at me from a face that's neither human nor animal. In the dreams, they don't let me go. In the dreams, they do what they came to do, and I wake up with my heart trying to claw its way out of my chest and my sheets soaked with sweat. The therapist I started seeing thinks it's PTSD. She doesn't know what the trauma was. I've never told her the truth, but she recognizes the symptoms, the hypervigilance, the insomnia, the way I flinch at unexpected sounds, the way I can't stand to be in wide open spaces after dark. She's prescribed medication that helps a little, taught me breathing exercises that help a little more. But she can't fix what's really broken. Because here's the thing. Knowing something exists changes you in ways you can't undo. Before that October, I lived in a world that made sense, a world with rules and boundaries and natural laws that couldn't be broken. Now I live in a world where things like that, things with yellow teeth and intelligent eyes and voices that shouldn't be able to form words, are real. They're out there right now in the cedar breaks of the Texas Hill Country, doing whatever it is they do when they're not tormenting people like me, and there's nothing I can do about it. Nothing anyone can do about it. I moved away. I changed my life. I don't go hiking anymore. Don't hunt. Don't drive on rural roads after dark. I check the locks on my doors 3 times before bed, and I never turn off all the lights. These are the accommodations I've made, the rituals I've developed to keep the fear at a manageable level. They work, mostly. They let me function. But I know with a certainty that goes deeper than thought, that if they wanted to find me again, they could. Distance doesn't matter to things like that. Walls don't matter. Locks and lights and second-floor apartments don't matter. They let me go because they chose to. And if they ever chose differently, there's nothing I could do to stop them. Sometimes I wonder if that's why they did it. If letting me go was part of the game too. If they wanted me to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, never feeling safe again. If that was the real hunt, and I'm still running even now, 14 months later, in a city hundreds of miles away from those cedar breaks. I don't have answers. I never will. Whatever those things were, werewolves, skinwalkers, something older and worse that doesn't have a name, they didn't explain themselves to me. They just showed me that the world is bigger and darker and more terrifying than I ever imagined. And then they walked away into the darkness, like I wasn't worth the effort of killing. I still call Sophie every Sunday. I still go to work every day and change oil and make small talk with customers who have no idea what I've seen. I still sit in my apartment at night and watch the darkness outside my windows and wait for eyes to appear. And some nights when the fear gets too big and the dreams get too real and I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from just beyond the edge of sight, I think about what Earl told me that last morning. Things that lived in these hills before the ranches, before the settlers, before anyone. Things with their own rules. I think about the way that creature looked at me when it let me go. The curiosity in its eyes, the intelligence, the sense that I was being evaluated by something so far beyond my understanding that I might as well have been an insect. I think about the word it spoke, in a voice that shouldn't have been able to form human language. Run. And I think, maybe I'm still running. Maybe I'll be running for the rest of my life. But at least I'm alive. That has to count for something.